The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, casting soft beams of light onto the polished marble floors. It was the kind of day that felt routine to most of the courthouse staff, clerks organizing files, bailiffs checking in with attorneys, and reporters quietly speculating about the high-profile cases set to unfold. But today, there was an added layer of tension, a subtle undercurrent in the air that made even the seasoned courthouse regulars shift in their seats. Word had spread that Tiffany Halsted's case was on the docket. Most people knew her name not because she had accomplished something remarkable, but because she had a talent for making headlines. The daughter of an old money real estate magnate, Tiffany had lived most of her life in luxury: private jets, designer wardrobes, exclusive parties, and a well-documented trail of reckless behavior. She wasn't just privileged, she was proud of it. She had never really faced consequences. Every time something went wrong, there was always a lawyer ready with a checkbook, a PR team ready with a statement, and a family name powerful enough to smooth over the ripples. But today, things felt different. This wasn't a party she could charm her way through, or a minor tabloid scandal she could bury with a shopping spree. This was a courtroom, and the man presiding over it was Judge William Grant, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was in his mid-50s, a former civil rights attorney known for his meticulous attention to detail, razor-sharp intellect, and a deep sense of fairness. He was a figure of calm authority, not easily provoked or impressed, and certainly not someone swayed by wealth or celebrity. The courtroom was already half full when Tiffany arrived. Late, of course. Her entrance turned heads immediately. She moved through the double doors as if she were stepping onto a red carpet. Her long platinum hair was perfectly styled, her outfit was high fashion, and the oversized sunglasses she wore indoors did little to hide her attitude. Her lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, trailed behind her, whispering something urgently. She paid him no mind. Her heels clicked loudly against the tile floor as she made her way down the center aisle, pausing for dramatic effect. She glanced around, mildly amused by the stares, then motioned for her attorney to step aside so she could place her designer handbag on the bench. With exaggerated flair, she removed her sunglasses, revealing a look of clear disinterest. She scanned the courtroom, yawning subtly as if the entire ordeal bored her. The people seated in the gallery watched in silence, some stunned by her audacity, others simply curious to see how far her arrogance would go. The bailiff cleared his throat, breaking the tension. All rise. The room stood in unison. A door to the left opened and Judge Grant entered, his robe swaying as he approached the bench. His presence changed the room immediately. The murmurs stopped. Even Tiffany paused for a moment before reluctantly standing with a sigh that could be heard several rows back. Her eyes rolled slightly as if the whole thing was beneath her. Judge Grant sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the case file without looking up. "Be seated," he said calmly. The courtroom resumed its seats, and the proceedings began. Judge Grant's voice was steady, professional, and measured. "Case of the State of California versus Tiffany Halsted," he announced, "for multiple parking violations, unlawful operation of a motor vehicle, and one count of reckless endangerment." Tiffany slouched in her seat, crossed her legs, and began tapping her nails on the wooden desk. The tapping, rhythmic and loud, drew glances from those seated nearby. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently again. She waved him off with a flick of her hand, her attention fixed on nothing in particular. Her expression screamed indifference. "As the court is aware," Judge Grant continued, "the charges brought against the defendant include not only repeated disregard for traffic laws, but a specific incident involving excessive speed in a residential area during which a pedestrian was nearly struck while crossing legally at an intersection." Tiffany's eyebrows arched. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, and rolled her eyes dramatically. The room stiffened. It wasn't just her lack of remorse, it was her total detachment from the reality of what had occurred. The gallery, filled with a mix of legal observers, press, and a few curious citizens, sensed something was brewing beneath Judge Grant's calm exterior. Then came the first sign of tension. "Miss Halsted," Judge Grant said, glancing up from the file for the first time. "Please confirm your identity for the record." Without looking directly at him, Tiffany replied, "Yeah, that's me," her tone laced with boredom. A subtle wave of murmurs passed through the courtroom. The court reporter paused briefly, eyes widening, then resumed typing. Tiffany's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to keep her from making things worse. But Tiffany was in her own world, a world where rules were optional. Judge Grant's face didn't change. His voice remained calm, but there was a steeliness in it now. "Miss Halsted, in this courtroom we maintain a level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany gave a half smile as if amused. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. There was a collective intake of breath. Some in the back of the courtroom exchanged looks. Even the bailiff, standing stoically near the bench, shifted ever so slightly, as though preparing for escalation. But Judge Grant didn't bite. He returned to the file, flipping a few pages. "Do you understand the charges brought against you?" he asked, not looking up. Tiffany let out a theatrical sigh. "Honestly, no, I mean, it's just a bunch of dumb tickets. And that thing with the guy, come on, he got scared because I hit the gas. Big deal, this is a waste of everyone's time." Now the murmurs returned, louder this time. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. Judge Grant closed the folder in front of him, slowly, deliberately. He took off his glasses and placed them gently on the bench. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. "Miss Halsted," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice still calm but now weighted with something else, finality. "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." Tiffany scoffed. "What? It's true. I didn't hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." Judge Grant's gaze didn't waver. "Do you recall the specific incident that led to this charge?" he asked. Tiffany shrugged. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked. He moved. End of story." Judge Grant tilted his head slightly. "End of story," he repeated. "Yeah, no harm, no foul," she said, crossing her arms and shifting in her chair again. Judge Grant flipped to a document and began reading. "Let the record show that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, age 67, was crossing the street legally at the time of the incident. Miss Halsted accelerated toward him at a speed measured at 37 miles per hour in a 25 zone. Mr. Lopez stumbled while trying to avoid the vehicle and sustained an injury to his right wrist. He has since undergone medical treatment and continues to experience pain." Tiffany's expression faltered. Her smirk faded just a little. She glanced at her lawyer, who whispered to her once again. She didn't respond. She just sat there, chewing the inside of her cheek, visibly annoyed but no longer fully confident. "I didn't hit him," she muttered under her breath. "He was fine." Judge Grant placed the document down and looked directly at her. "Does that sound like no harm, no foul to you, Miss Halsted?" She didn't answer. The room was dead silent. The shift in energy was palpable. Everyone sensed it. The gap between her privilege and the gravity of the moment. Tiffany had spent years surrounded by people who softened the blows of her mistakes, who cleaned up her messes before they left a mark. But not today, not in this courtroom. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Miss Halsted," he said, "your perspective is troubling, not simply because of the charges, but because of your inability to grasp the impact of your actions." Still, Tiffany kept her posture defiant, though the discomfort was now evident. "Look, I said I didn't hit him. People are just too sensitive these days." That comment caused several people in the gallery to gasp quietly. The audacity of it, the dismissiveness, it was too much for some to process. Judge Grant tapped a pen gently on the bench. The sound echoed in the silence. "Dramatic," he repeated, the word hanging in the air. Then he said something that pulled everyone forward in their seats. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, because he is here today, in this courtroom?" Tiffany blinked, her head turned, eyes scanning the courtroom gallery. And then she saw him, an older man seated quietly in the second row, his arm in a sling. His face wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful, it was just sad. The kind of sadness that doesn't shout or accuse, but lingers with the weight of disappointment. Tiffany looked away. She shifted in her seat. Her confidence was starting to break, not from fear, but from something she hadn't expected, being truly seen, not as a celebrity, not as a name in the tabloids, but as a person being held accountable. Her world, once so carefully insulated, had just been pierced. And the silence in that courtroom, heavy, expectant, was just the beginning. The silence after Judge Grant's announcement was thick enough to touch. It wrapped around the courtroom like a weighted blanket, pressing down on everyone present. All eyes had shifted from Tiffany to the man seated quietly in the second row, Edward Lopez, the retired teacher, the man whose calm presence now eclipsed Tiffany's expensive aura, sat with his arm in a sling and an expression of quiet strength. He wasn't angry. He didn't glare. His disappointment said more than rage ever could. Tiffany's eyes flicked to Mr. Lopez and then quickly back to the table in front of her. For the first time since she had strutted into the room, she looked uncertain. The smirk that had been glued to her face vanished, replaced by something much rarer in her world, an expression of discomfort. Her lawyer leaned toward her again, whispering softly, his voice nearly inaudible. She didn't push him away this time. She didn't respond either. She simply stared ahead, shoulders tense, fingers twitching slightly as they rested against the wood grain of the defendant's table. Judge Grant didn't speak for a moment. He let the tension settle, allowed the weight of Mr. Lopez's presence to be felt. Then, in that same measured tone, he continued. "Miss Halsted," he said, his voice resonating across the hushed courtroom, "your dismissal of this man's pain, this man who sits here in silence rather than shouting, speaks volumes about your character. And while this court exists to uphold the law, it also carries a deeper responsibility. We must consider what kind of society we are encouraging when people with privilege believe themselves above accountability." A few heads nodded in the gallery. Others simply stared, absorbing every word. No one looked at their phones. No one dared to fidget. Judge Grant had turned the courtroom into a lesson, a mirror, and Tiffany Halsted was being forced to see her reflection for what it was. "You see," Judge Grant went on, "this case is no longer just about a traffic violation. It's about a mindset. It's about entitlement that insulates itself from consequence. You could have injured Mr. Lopez more seriously. You could have cost him his life. But you didn't even take the time to find out how he was doing. Not once." Tiffany opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Her gaze shifted again to Mr. Lopez, whose sling rested visibly against his chest. She looked away just as quickly, her jaw tightening. Judge Grant didn't raise his voice, but his words hit harder than a shout ever could. "Since you seem unconcerned with the effects of your behavior," he said, "perhaps it's time you experience those effects in a more personal way." Tiffany blinked. There was a flicker of alarm in her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice noticeably sharper, laced with a defensiveness she could no longer fully disguise. Judge Grant remained composed. "It means," he said slowly, "that in addition to the standard penalties for your actions, this court will be imposing a sentence designed not only to punish, but to educate." The bailiff stepped forward and handed him a set of documents. Judge Grant scanned them briefly, then looked back at Tiffany. "You will pay a series of fines, totaling $15,000, which will be directed toward pedestrian safety initiatives in this city. In addition, you will complete 200 hours of court-ordered community service." Tiffany leaned back in her seat, exhaling sharply. She folded her arms again, as if trying to armor herself against what was coming next. Judge Grant continued, "But the most important component of your sentence, Miss Halsted, is this. You will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter." A wave of surprise rolled through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats. A couple of reporters quickly scribbled notes. The murmurs started again, soft but rising like steam. Tiffany's expression twisted. "Excuse me?" she snapped, eyes wide with disbelief. "You heard me correctly," Judge Grant replied. 30 days. Every morning you will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. sharp. You will work directly with women who have experienced loss, trauma, displacement, circumstances that you've likely never had to consider. This sentence is not about humiliation, it's about perspective, and if you fail to comply, you will be back in this courtroom under far less favorable conditions. Tiffany's mouth opened. She stared at the judge as though he had just suggested she scrub floors with a toothbrush for a year. You want me to, what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Her lawyer froze. Judge Grant remained still. It is precisely that mindset, he said coolly, that brought you here in the first place. Your actions have made it painfully clear that you do not understand how deeply your behavior affects others. This sentence is an opportunity to develop that understanding. Tiffany turned to her lawyer, grabbing his arm. This is insane, she hissed. You can't let them do this to me. Her attorney leaned in, whispering something. She shook her head furiously. Her voice rose again, defiant and cracking. I don't belong in a shelter. I didn't do anything wrong. The judge raised his hand, signaling her to stop. The courtroom fell silent again. Miss Halsted, he said firmly, you are free to appeal, but know this, if you walk out of here today refusing to comply, I will issue a bench warrant and you will face jail time instead. The choice is yours, shelter or cell. Tiffany sat frozen. The entire courtroom seemed to be watching her breathe. Her lawyer pulled a tissue from his pocket and handed it to her. She didn't take it. Her hands were clenched into fists on her lap. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. This had never happened to her before. She was always the exception. The rules never applied. Judge Grant leaned forward again. His voice softened, but the weight of his words remained. Miss Halsted, he said, this court does not exist to shame people. It exists to uphold justice. But every so often, justice comes with a chance to reflect, to learn and to grow. Your name, your wealth, your image, none of that will matter at the shelter. What will matter is how you treat others, how you listen, how you show up. You've been given so much, now it's time to give something back. Tiffany stared ahead, unblinking. It was all unraveling. She had come in thinking this would be quick. She'd smile for the judge, sign a few forms, maybe pay a fine and be done by brunch. Instead, she was being handed a mirror, and what she saw in it was rattling her. Judge Grant picked up the gavel. This court is adjourned, he said, and the wood struck the bench with a resounding crack. As he stood and exited, people began to stir. Reporters gathered their notepads. A camera flashed near the door. Mr. Lopez remained seated for a moment, watching Tiffany with a gaze that wasn't cold, but wasn't forgiving either. Just firm, like someone who hoped she'd learn before it was too late. As he walked past her on his way out, he didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, then turned and left. That single moment, quiet and powerful, seemed to stick to the air around Tiffany like humidity. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she just sat there, her expensive purse now looking oddly out of place. Her lawyer gathered the documents and leaned toward her once more. We'll talk, he said softly. She didn't nod, she didn't argue. Her eyes were locked on the spot where Mr. Lopez had been sitting. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun their chorus. Miss Halsted, do you believe the judge's sentence was fair? Do you feel targeted because of your background? Any comment on your community service? Tiffany said nothing. Her lawyer shielded her from the flashes of cameras and the probing microphones. She climbed into the back of a waiting black SUV, slammed the door and stared straight ahead. Inside the car, her facade started to crack. Her jaw tightened, then loosened. Her hands, once resting calmly in her lap, began to tremble. She closed her eyes briefly, then pulled her phone from her bag. The screen lit up with dozens of messages, texts, social media tags, news alerts. Her name was trending, again, but not for a red carpet look or a weekend getaway. This time, the headlines read differently. Judge sends socialite to women's shelter in stunning sentence. From catwalks to community service, Tiffany Halsted ordered to work with the homeless. Privileged heiress learns hard lesson in courtroom clash. Clips from the hearing had already made their way online. Short videos with captions, TikToks dissecting her reaction, tweets quoting Judge Grant's final statement, and worst of all, a shaky phone video of her snapping, "That's not my problem," was going viral, shared by thousands, with no shortage of opinions. She locked her phone and tossed it into her bag. Her fingers clenched the leather strap tightly. That night, the story exploded across media outlets. Pundits debated whether the judge's sentence was just or performative. Others praised him for using the moment to teach, not just punish. But amidst all the noise, the quietest voice was the most powerful. Mr. Lopez, approached by a local reporter outside the courthouse, said only this: "I don't want her to suffer. I just hope she learns, because when we stop learning, we stop growing. And that's when we really lose." His words struck a chord. They echoed across platforms, shared by people from all walks of life. And while most viewers would move on in a few days, for Tiffany, the real challenge was just beginning. Monday was approaching, and with it, the start of a sentence that no amount of privilege could shield her from. The morning air bit just a little as Tiffany stood on the sidewalk outside the downtown women's shelter. The sun hadn't fully risen, casting a pale glow over the city. She wore a long, beige trench coat over designer jeans and white sneakers, clean, barely worn, and glaringly out of place. Her oversized sunglasses masked the apprehension in her eyes, but her clenched jaw and crossed arms revealed more than she intended. Cars honked in the distance, and the faint sound of city life stirred, but inside her chest, silence thundered. This wasn't the kind of building Tiffany was used to entering. It wasn't made of glass and chrome or guarded by valets. The shelter's exterior was modest, almost tired. A weathered blue sign hung over the door, the paint faded from years of sun. Volunteers trickled in with paper coffee cups and tote bags, chatting quietly as they passed her. No one paused to greet her. No one noticed her sunglasses or the designer bag slung over her shoulder. And for the first time in years, Tiffany Halsted was just someone. A woman with short cropped hair and a clipboard stepped out, scanning the sidewalk before locking eyes with Tiffany. She looked to be in her 40s, sturdy, efficient, no nonsense. She walked up, clipboard tucked under one arm, and gave a small professional smile. "You must be Tiffany," she said, voice clear but not unkind. "I'm Janice. Let's get you signed in." Tiffany nodded stiffly and followed her inside. The warmth of the shelter contrasted sharply with the chill outside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Volunteers moved around purposefully, some in the kitchen prepping breakfast, others arranging chairs or checking clipboards. The walls were lined with posters about support services, food programs, mental health counseling. Everything here served a purpose. There was no pretense. Janice handed her a schedule. "You'll be working in the kitchen today," she said. "Prep, serve, and clean up. After that, we'll assign you to inventory. You'll rotate weekly between meals, intake assistance, childcare, and admin." Tiffany blinked. "Wait, I thought I'd be observing or something. I didn't think I'd actually be working." Janice raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a photo op. We all work here, including you." Tiffany didn't respond. She simply nodded and followed Janice through the shelter, past the dining hall where women sat talking over breakfast, some with children clinging to their sides. They looked tired but calm, guarded but grounded. Life here wasn't easy, but it was real. By 8:30, Tiffany stood behind the prep counter, a hairnet awkwardly pulled over her carefully styled hair, an apron tied over her coat. She peeled potatoes, clumsily at first, wincing with every slip of the peeler. Beside her, a woman in her 60s named Carla worked swiftly and with practiced ease. "First day?" Carla asked with a smile. "Yeah," Tiffany muttered, not looking up. "You'll get used to it," Carla said. "Just watch your fingers." They worked in silence for a while. Tiffany's shoulders slowly loosened. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was grounding in a way she couldn't explain. There was something about peeling potatoes beside a stranger, about seeing her hands actually create something that felt more real than most of her adult life. When breakfast was served, Tiffany stood behind the counter dishing out scrambled eggs. She kept her head down, barely speaking, but she watched. She watched the women walk in, some clutching kids, others walking slowly with fatigue. She watched them smile as they thanked the servers, despite the hardship in their eyes. She watched a young girl offer half her toast to her little brother, patting his shoulder when he looked overwhelmed. She watched a teenager help an older woman find a seat, holding her arm gently. Tiffany had never seen this kind of kindness, not in the clubs, not at the parties, not at the fundraisers where people only smiled for the camera. This was different. These people didn't have anything to prove. They weren't selling anything. They just showed up again and again because survival demanded it. After breakfast, Tiffany helped clean. Then she helped organize the donations closet, sorting clothes, checking labels, folding shirts. It wasn't hard, but it was constant. By lunchtime, her arms ached and her feet throbbed. She hadn't looked at her phone all morning. She didn't notice the silence. That afternoon, Janice handed her a clipboard and pointed toward a small room near the intake desk. "You'll help with intake tomorrow," she said. "Today, shadow the front desk. Just listen." Tiffany did as she was told. She sat in a corner chair and watched as women came in and told their stories, some in tears, some with forced calm, some so numb they barely spoke. One woman had just left an abusive partner, another had aged out of foster care and was alone, a third came in with a baby, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and fear. Tiffany felt herself shrinking in that chair. The details were painful, but it was the resilience that stunned her. That night, Tiffany didn't go out. She didn't call anyone. She sat on her apartment balcony, untouched takeout beside her, and stared at the lights of the city. She thought about Mr. Lopez. She thought about the women at the shelter. She thought about her life, how many days she'd wasted in pursuit of nothing real. And for the first time she wondered what she was even chasing. The next days followed a rhythm, mornings in the kitchen, afternoons at the front desk, evenings reflecting. She began to talk to the other volunteers, listening to why they showed up each day. One was a retired nurse, another a college student. One had even been a resident of the shelter years ago and returned as a way to give back. Tiffany was slow to open up, but as the days passed, she began to engage. She stopped hiding behind her sunglasses. She showed up early. She stayed late. She asked questions. She smiled. Hesitantly at first, but then more often. The women she served began to recognize her, not as the tabloid darling, not as a spoiled heiress, but as someone present, someone trying. One afternoon, she sat in the courtyard during her break, sipping coffee from a paper cup. A woman named Darlene sat beside her, middle-aged, wiry, with kind eyes and a voice like gravel. "You're Tiffany, right?" Darlene asked. Tiffany nodded. "You were on the news. That judge sent you here." Tiffany nodded again, bracing herself. Darlene chuckled. "Good for him. More people should see what it's like." Tiffany looked up, surprised. "You think I deserve this?" Darlene shrugged. "I think you're here. That counts. Lots of people wouldn't have shown up at all." Tiffany looked at her cup. "I didn't get it before. I didn't think anything I did really mattered." Darlene exhaled, slow and steady. "That's the thing about privilege. It makes the world feel small. You don't see how big the consequences are until you look around." The words stuck with Tiffany. That night, she wrote in a notebook she hadn't touched in years. Just thoughts, not filtered for Instagram, not planned for press. Just her voice, honest, unsure, and finally awake. By the end of the month, Tiffany's transformation was not radical, but it was real. She still wore designer jeans, but now they had flour on them. Her hair wasn't always perfect. Her phone stayed in her bag most of the day. She started laughing with the other volunteers. She made PB&Js for kids who reminded her of her little cousins. She stood beside the same women who had once intimidated her and felt, for the first time, like a part of something. On her last day at the shelter, the staff threw a small goodbye lunch. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches, cookies, and paper plates. But it felt like a ceremony. Janice gave her a certificate. "You didn't phone it in," she said. "You showed up. That matters." Tiffany hugged her, not for show, for real. When she returned to court the following week, the gallery was quieter than before. Fewer cameras, less buzz, but the gravity of the moment still hung in the air. Judge Grant took the bench, his expression unchanged. "Miss Halsted," he said, "you've completed your sentence. Do you have anything to say before I close this matter?" Tiffany stood. Her lawyer had offered to speak, but she had declined. She looked directly at the judge, then at Mr. Lopez, who sat once again in the gallery, arm healed, face kind. "I came here thinking this was a punishment," she said, "but it became something else. I saw things I'd never seen before. I heard stories that changed how I think about the world, and I saw how blind I'd been, not just to other people, but to myself." She paused. "I'm not proud of how I acted, but I'm grateful I was made to stop and look, really look. Thank you for not giving up on me." The courtroom was still. Judge Grant nodded slowly. "The real thanks," he said, "will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference, outside this courtroom." And with that, the gavel fell. Tiffany walked out into the daylight. No reporters, no crowd. Just the city she'd grown up in, now full of faces she had finally started to see. And somewhere, not far from the courthouse, Mr. Lopez walked home. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some lessons don't need noise, just eyes to see, ears to listen, and hearts willing to change. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.